So I was recommended to check out an argument by AzureScapegoat on Cuba claiming that it's democratic.
If you live in any of these countries, and by these countries I really mean this country, it may come as a shock to you that Cuba is not a totalitarian dictatorship ruled by a single person. In fact, Cuba has a very interesting system of participatory democracy.
I mean, who in the right mind would turn around and say that Cuba's this, democracy? It's been living under dictatorship for decades. It's one of the least free countries on planet Earth. It's like someone turning around and saying to you that the Soviet Union was democratic. Economics and history is not on their side. Just like a socialist who tries to make the so-called credible argument that somehow ramping up oil production caused Venezuela's food shortage crisis, but this doesn't add up because there was a food shortage crisis in Venezuela even during the oil boom in 2003. Christian Yimyet's book on Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, he doesn't really go into information about why socialism fails. Goes on about that to do with the mentality of these socialists, and it's a fantastic book for that. It's got a lot of fantastic sources. What you find is that the mentality of these socialists is just unreal. But when you go through the book and you see the level of denial, then it just clarifies the point, because I've known for years now that socialists really are just purely driven by emotion, and a good number of them really are cultist. He mentions about 3 phases. Phase 1 is the honeymoon period. Then in the second phase there's the phase of excuses. Once they go through so much failure, they then fall silent, and then after that they enter the third phase, which is the denial phase. You could see this with regards to Venezuela, because during the period, and I even remember this, during the 2000s, Venezuela was called this socialist democratic paradise. That was its honeymoon phase. Quite funny that, given the fact it was faced with blackouts and shortages, etc. That goes to show you the level of denial. And one of them was that to do with Noam Chomsky. He boasted that it was this democratic socialist place that the world should look at. And it wasn't until it entered the third phase, which is the phase where its failure was just so abysmal, that he would later then say, oh, it was never socialist to begin with. It was this state capitalist, usual nonsense. Surprise, surprise, because this was the same man who then later said that the Soviet Union was state capitalist. Oh, it is never socialist. Like every other socialist regime that's been an abysmal failure. To give you a hint of the level of denial of these people, in the 1920s, of course, you had all the labour camps, etc., and there was 70,000 people that were kept in them, and as you know, these were people who were brutally murdered. Pure evil, to say the least. These Western pilgrims turned up in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, said that they visited the labour camps and that these people were all happy and peaceful, etc. And what that basically is telling you is that their ideology means more to them than the reality of what happened to them. So they will literally go to the extent of denying what happened to the people in order to protect the name of socialism. And it's funny that, because in the Soviet Union they did exactly that. If anyone did anything wrong, they were basically to be killed off, because you cannot damage the reputation of socialism. So when it comes to someone like AzureScapegoat on Cuba, you're not going to get any sort of reasonable argument.
Thank you to the Swedish-Cuban organisation in Gothenburg for helping me with this video.
In terms of politicians, etc., and what they're putting through their education system, I wouldn't even take that country seriously in terms of who runs it. Really, seriously wouldn't. And I'm sure many Swedish people would agree with me on that. Just from a few sources that I had picked out. One was by the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba. Now, of course, it's open to critique. Of course, there's probably other sources out there. I don't say that anything to do with the BBC, first and foremost, is anything that I would say I hold credence in. I certainly don't. It goes on to mention about Diaz-Canel. It says, became president in a handover by Raul Castro. There was no real participation from the Cuban people in the election process. Again, let me re-emphasise what it states there. It says there was no real participation. Again, socialists misinterpret things. Doesn't mean to say there wasn't participation. What it's saying is there was no real participation from the Cuban people in the election process. What that means to say is it wouldn't matter even if people, voted. Who cares if they voted? If they vote in a system where there's no real choice, choice. It's not really democratic, is it? So that's what it means when it says there was no real participation from the Cuban people in the election process. And it backs this, and it says the new president has already promised to preserve the island's one-party system. There you have it, a one-party system. It says, and Raul Castro remains in control of the government's direction as the leader of Cuba's Communist Party. It's basically the illusion of choice. Unfortunately, democracy throughout recorded history has led to plutocracy. I'm not the biggest fan. It goes on to say, it is clear that the government in Cuba will continue being a dictatorship as it has been under the Castro brothers.
Neither money nor political parties have a place in the nomination process. Political parties are permitted in Cuba. However, they are not allowed to nominate or campaign for candidates.
Well, okay, so it goes on to state, the Communist Party of Cuba, PCC, considers itself to be a democracy of the people, but it has nothing to do with the democracy because it gives the Cuban people no real choices in electing their leaders. The PCC outlaws any other political party. Anyone running for office must be of the Communist Party, and the electoral process is intentionally murky. So how's that even democracy? So you must be running for that of the Communist Party. There is no choice for people to have a party that represents capitalism, libertarianism. Instead, it's a choice between a socialist and a socialist. It's that thing where socialists think, we'll get the people to vote and that's what we'll call democracy. No, democracy is about choice. It kind of reminds me of what I heard more recently about Hong Kong when the Umbrella Revolution broke out, and I remember questioning about this, and it's an illusion of choice and democracy because the communists of China had basically given them a choice between one communist muppet and another communist muppet. What choice did the Hong Kong people have? And they eventually got to see the true colours of that democracy. When it comes to these socialists like AzureScapegoat, etc., they do not accept reality. It wouldn't matter all the evidence in the world you provide them with. There's an emotional attachment with regards to socialism. That's why you're never going to get through to them. And it's the same emotional attachment that they have to hating capitalism. And all I've got to say to that of the walk away crowd, or those who are considering and walk away, and if you have any sense, and if you see my video, take my advice, get away from them as soon as possible, because these people will make you feel depressed, because you will always be on the losing side. Trust me, you always will. These people are far removed from reason. They're not even logical minded people. Like I said, in the honeymoon phase, each honeymoon phase, like Christian Yemyets points out in his book Socialism, the Failed Ideal That Never Dies, he mentions about the fact that they would seriously call it a democratic regime. But isn't it funny that as soon as the failure became too much, that they then, deny that ever being the case? In fact, they go as far as to say, oh, that wasn't socialism. In fact, some even go as far as to say, oh, under Stalin it was never socialism. How can you even call it a socialist regime under that of Joseph Stalin? Okay. In theory, we understand communism was all about the moneyless, classless, stateless and all this thing. They think that just because if something doesn't live up to what it's stated in theory, that somehow that makes it less socialist. This is why these people are delusional. As it says, Cuba's president is supposedly chosen by the National Assembly, whose members are selected by government-designated commissions and vetted by top leadership. All the public can do is process of nominating National Assembly members is to vote to approve or reject the candidates that have already been pre-selected. Exactly. Does that sound familiar to you? It bloody well should, because that's exactly what it sounds like today. Pre-selected, giving people the illusion of choice. It says NBC News, right? Again, I'm not even someone who believes in, these news channels, etc. It explains that it is no coincidence that each one usually receives at least 95% approval rate. This process is thinly veiled sham, since the National Assembly just does whatever the island's executive power wants. And it says, according to the Chicago Tribune, which of course I turned to the Chicago Tribune, we'll read that in a second, it says the Assembly approves all executive branch proposals by margins of 95% or more. For example, in the last election for president, it is widely known that Miguel Diaz-Canel was Raul Castro's clear choice for a successor, and the National Assembly just went along with his choice. The illusion of choice. So let's turn to what is the Chicago Tribune. This was posted in 2017, right? So this was obviously before Diaz, I think his name is, before he became the president of course, that of Cuba. So it says, where is the world's outrage over Cuba's dictatorship? Well, you're not going to hear it from socialists. Instead, socialists will twist everything they possibly can to protect the name of their religious ideology, and that's what they do. Socialists are not interested in facts, reason and logic, and you can spot a mile away just how fake they are when they speak about how, oh, I feel for those, workers who are working all those hard hours, and they're being so exploited, it's so awful. It's so awful, yet here I am, continuing to support an ideology, even although it is precisely what caused the suffering of the Venezuelan people. So what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to pretend I care about all those Venezuelan people suffering, and I'll pretend I care so much about them. Meanwhile, if you provide me any facts, I'll stare right past them and use excuses. That's how much I care about them. Latin American countries deserve credit for the recent denunciations of what they bluntly refer to the Venezuelan dictatorship, but I have a hard time understanding why they don't do the same thing with Cuba's dictatorship. When it comes to the Cuba, they all seem to look the other way. Well, interesting enough, in, of course, Christian Nemeth's book, he goes on to state the fact that Cuba was stuck between phase 2 and 3. In other words, Cuba is somewhat of an exception. The whole thing to do with the education, healthcare, in other words, the 95% literacy rate, but like I said, when it came to the literacy rate, was already there long before Fidel Castro, so it was never the cause. But of course, this is one of the reasons why they cling on to it. They have what you call a touristy section of Cuba, where the tourists go, and this is a section of Cuba that is given the luxury. So in other words, in terms of the healthcare that they receive in the section of Cuba and the touristy section is much different from what the actual Cuban people living in Cuba receive.
The only way to get good health care in Castro's Cuba is to be a tourist with lots of cold hard cash. Another way to do it is to be part of the political elite, part of Castro's administration. But if you happen to be a Cuban, you happen to be a citizen, you have very limited access to anything that would represent real healthcare the way you and I know it.
So this is the thing, that life in Cuba is absolutely horrid. When it came to Turning Point USA, they were being warned, threatened to leave the country as soon as possible. They don't want the world seeing what Cuba is actually like.
What do you think of socialism?
It's very popular.
Yeah.
Wow. But now for us, no, it's good. For Cuban people now,
Not good?
no, my friend, no, it's possible petroleum,
Yeah.
nothing. For this, the people, no, it's possible go for the working.
Listen to me.
Uh-huh.
My country is very because everything problem here. Don't have petroleum for bus and Cuban, for car, for drive, for nothing. You understand? My country is very
Because it would damage the face and reputation of socialism. I was thinking about this when I read about Cuba's October 22nd election for municipal council members. It'll be the first of several tightly controlled steps leading to the election of the National Assembly that is to decide the successor to Cuban President Raul Castro, 86, who has vowed to step down in February. It says, but of course Cuba's National Assembly will just rubber stamp whomever Castro picks. Cuba has been hereditary a dictatorship since 1959, when the late Cuban president Fidel Castro took power by force, and later when he became ill, he passed on the country's government to his brother Raul in 2006. Now Raul Castro is widely expected to hand the presidency either to his son Alejandro Castro Espin or to Cuba's current first vice president Miguel Diaz-Canel. Either way, it'll be Castro's decision with zero real input from the Cuban people. Pre-selected, in other words. And this is exactly what this AzureScapegoat considers to be democracy, simply because the people have a vote. What do they have a vote for? Something pre-selected? Something of an illusion of choice? What democracy really that is? You weren't informed, in other words. You just didn't know what you're voting for. That's exactly what these people are like. Socialists are naturally like that. It's the true face of them. There's no such thing as democratic socialism. Anybody with a rational mind that looks at anything like that and someone saying that, of course, Cuba is not a dictatorship, the first thing that they think is, what is this person on? What planet does this person live on? And like I said, it's an illusion of choice. It's one of the least free countries on the planet Earth. So anyway, if you've got any sources that you would like to add, if you've got anything you would like to, personally add in yourself, feel free to comment in the comment section below. I'm not surprised, in fact, any longer when it comes to these people. If you've picked up anything from this video, anything educational, well, that's credit, that's something else. Just be prepared that they'll attack the sources rather than the actual information. They're more than free to come back with any counter arguments themselves. I hardly believe they've got anything credible, because just because you vote for something, just because people have a vote, it doesn't mean to say that it's democratic. Again, it's the illusion of choice. So anyway, folk, thank you for watching my video, and of course I shall talk to you later. Cheers.